Well, I've actually kind of like a cradle scientist in the sense that I've always known I was going to be a scientist since I was old enough to speak, really. I was one of these nerdy kids that when my brothers were out playing football in the park, I'd be reading math books, curled up with a math book. And even in grade school, my fellow students called me the professor or something like that. Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of inevitable. I don't think I ever actually thought about what I was going to be. It was kind of known from the start that I was going to go into physics or science, a mathematical kind of science. So that's my story. As far as being a Catholic, I'm also a cradle Catholic. So I've been actually thinking about science and religion and how they relate to each other for a very long time, since I was early in my teens, I would say. Well, actually, that maybe goes back to the question that you first asked, which is there's something, a commonality in my interest in science, my interest in theological questions. I like to understand how things fit together in a coherent way. And that's why I went into a branch of science. I work a lot on what are called grand unified theories. A lot of my research was on that, which tries to understand how the different forces of nature fit together into a single mathematical structure. But I also wanted my religious views and my religious beliefs and what I know as a scientist to see how they fit together in a coherent way. And so it's kind of a privilege to be in fundamental physics because you get to see things that very few other people see, which is the magnificence, the harmony of the laws of physics and their great beauty and subtlety and depth, and how the whole physical universe fits. Everything in the physical universe sort of fits together in a harmonious way, and also that that does have an impact on my view of God or my view of theological questions, because it gives me more of a feeling of the these are awesome, it's overused, but it gives me an appreciation of the magnificence of the created world, and thus something about the creator of this world. I mean, one of my favorite scriptural passages is, as far as the heavens are above the earth, are my thoughts above your thoughts, and my ways above your ways. I think that's what it goes. And you see how profound the mind is that conceived of this universe when you get to look at some of the inner workings of the physical world by studying fundamental physics. So in that sense, my science has given me a greater appreciation of the greatness of God and of creation. I don't think my faith necessarily affects how I do physics, but my physics has deepened my appreciation of certain things, religious truths. One kind of discussion which I'm not involved in is questions about technology and its moral implications and social implications, things, the ethical uses of science, biomedical ethics questions, environmental questions, and so on. I'm more focused on the different kind of science faith question than that, which is, can you be a person of faith and be a scientist, a person who also sees the world scientifically. Don't have, or as the new atheists say, must a person who believes in modern science reject God and believe in God and religion altogether? That's the area that I'm focused on. Interestingly, a lot of the basic arguments of that in that area, for example, the arguments the new atheists make against religion are actually, many of them are very old. They go back to the 19th century. But actually, this was the topic of my book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. In the 20th century, I argue, a number of important developments and scientific discoveries actually seem to sit better with a religious view of the world than with an atheistic or materialistic view of the world. And so there have been, I would say the 20th century has been a very important time where new things were discovered that are relevant to the science faith debate or question. I can just give a few examples. So before the 20th century, science seemed to be going in the direction that the universe had no beginning. It always existed for infinite time. In the 20th century, we discovered that the universe probably had a beginning. Certainly there was a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago, and most probably that is the beginning of the universe. And even if that wasn't the beginning of the universe, probably the universe did have a beginning at some point. That's a big shift in perspective. And many people see that as sitting more comfortably with a religious view than with an atheistic view. But there are other developments too. And I would say in another development that's happened in the last, especially 30 or 40 years, but it's growing in interest to scientists, is something that's people sometimes call anthropic coincidences. Yeah. So one thing atheists were fond of saying is that the universe seems pointless. You look at this cold, impersonal universe of ours, and it seems like the universe doesn't care about us, whether we live or die, and it's governed by these cold, impersonal laws, and we're just kind of a fluke. We're just this kind of chemical accident that occurred on some tiny planet lost in the vastness of space. Whereas religion said we were kind of important in the scheme of things, and science seems to say we're not important at all. We're just a tiny infinitesimal speck in this universe, and an accidental one at that. In the last 30 or 40 years, especially physicists have become aware increasingly that the laws of nature, as we know them, seem in many ways almost to be arranged to make life possible. And if you take the laws as we know them and you change them a little bit, you make a certain parameter bigger or smaller and so on, that would have had radical effects on the way the universe developed, and in many cases made it impossible for the universe to have life in it. So some people use this as an argument and say, look, the very fundamental laws of physics and the structure of the universe are sort of seem to be arranged to make it possible for there to be living things. And so that clearly has theological implications. There's a counter argument or a way of explaining these things in a naturalistic way called the multiverse, which is a serious and interesting idea. There's been a lot more attention, I would say, to this whole area. I've seen interest among physicists and philosophers and theologians, interest in this particular topic growing steadily over the last 30 years. So and there's other areas too where I can see the interest in some of these other developments growing in the last 7 decades. So those are some of the, but certainly interest in the whole subject of how science and religion fit together has been very hot lately in the last 20 years, I'd say. Because one of the big questions is, are we ourselves just machines? Are we just very complex biochemical machines? Is there such a thing as the spiritual soul? Are we just very, very complex animals? And do we have free will? Is there anything radically different, any radical difference between a human being and lower animals, or just a difference of degree? And that, I think, is going to be a bigger and bigger question. Because as computers get so powerful that they can simulate what in a human being would be highly intelligent behavior, it's going to be easier and easier for people to think that they may be conscious, because they can simulate conscious. That they're conscious, that they may be free, that that they have rationality, that they're maybe even smarter than we are in some sense. And you actually see that already happening due to science fiction. You had is it Data in one of the Star Trek series, right, and how and in science fiction we have all of these intelligent robots that are conscious and have feelings and free will and so on. And so I think that actually had a huge effect on how ordinary people think, because it becomes much more plausible to them that maybe if there can be, at least in fiction, there can be these intelligent machines, and maybe we ourselves are machines. And I think the almost frightening abilities of computers now is just going to make that impression stronger and stronger. And I think that's going to be a big area where we have to explain to people why they shouldn't, try to make them not fall for a simplistic notion that we're just machines ourselves. And we do have a soul, and there are aspects of us that are not simply machine-like. I see that as a bigger and bigger question as time goes on. I played chess as a hobby. Now chess programs have been taught. They used to be, the chess playing programs were simply brute force calculation. You could sort of tell the difference between how a human played and how a machine played, and the humans certainly had. But now they're actually training computers to play chess in a more human-like way. So their abilities, now they combine vast computational power of trillions of calculations a second with a more human strategy of thinking about the game. So that now they've taken a huge leap in strength. So now the computers are the best computers are just way better than the best humans. It's and there's still nobody thinks that the computers are actually conscious or that they actually understand anything. But there may come a day when their powers are so great that the illusion that they are actually understanding will be hard to resist. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So a few years ago, actually in June of 2016, a handful of us, of colleagues, I think it was 6 of us at the time, incorporated something called the Society of Catholic Scientists. And so that's a little over 2.5 years ago. And we're now up to, I think as of last night, we passed the 1,000 member mark. And of those, 3/4 of them have doctorates in natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, earth sciences, and so on, mathematics. And the others are mostly grad students and some undergrad. So, what motivated us to start it, let me just say what the 4 main goals of it are. In our bylaws and our mission statement and so on, we have 4 goals. The first, and maybe the most important, is fellowship among Catholic scientists, intellectual and spiritual fellowship. The second is to be a forum for discussion of science faith questions. A third, also very important, which hopefully will be increasing, we'll be doing more of as time goes on, is to be a witness to the world that there are many scientists who are faithful Catholics. To be a living witness to the harmony between faith and science. And fourth, to be an educational resource for the general public, but also for journalists, for theologians, Catholic pastors, and Catholic educators, high school teachers, and so on. Again, that's something we hope to do more and more of as time goes on. The fellowship part is very important, and I can tell you my own experience, and this is sort of what made me think for many years of starting such an organization. What you experience if you're a religious person, a Catholic, but in general a religious person in the science, is not hostility, because actually many scientists are actually religious. It's not that all scientists are atheists, as many people may think. You don't encounter hostility. What you encounter is a sense of isolation. And the reason you encounter that is many religious people in the sciences, and I think it's not just in science, but in the academic world, tend to be very private about their beliefs because they're afraid that they might be discriminated against or thought ill of or whatever. And so they tend to keep it under wraps. And I think for young people that may be a good strategy. It depends what field you're in, who you're dealing with. Don't want to make people paranoid, but there are reasons if you're young and you don't have tenure, and if it may be that 1 out of 20 people you deal with are hostile to religion, but it may be that 1 out of 20 is making a decision about whether you get a promotion, whether you get a postdoc position, or whatever. So there is some prudence necessary. But the result, many are afraid to be too open about their faith, and the consequence of that is that you might have in your environment many religious scientists or science students, and you don't know it. And so you think you're alone. And when I was in grad school, I could not have named a single world-famous scientist of our day that was religious. And I couldn't have told you any of the professors when I was a grad student at Princeton. I couldn't have told you a single professor in the physics department who I knew to be religious. Now, there were some, but I didn't know that. And so then you begin to say, am I the only one? Am I the only one in the world? Am I crazy, or is the rest of the world crazy? Well, it can be very demoralizing and make you begin to doubt that maybe you're the one that's crazy. And so I think it's very important for the Catholics in science and for religious people in science to know that they're not alone. And so joining an organization like ours, you immediately know that there are a lot of like-minded people, other religious people, and you can even find out who they are. We don't publicize our members, but once you are a member and have a password, you can go look at the member directory, and you can and find out a lot of people, and maybe at your own institution. And I think that's a huge psychological boost. And get to talk to people about questions of science and faith, who can discuss them, at the same level as you are. So, but then I think also the public outreach is equally important, because you can have a philosopher or a theologian telling the world there's no conflict between science and faith. And they may say it persuasively and intelligently, but people are not going to believe it as much as if they hear it from a scientist saying. And they're not even going to believe a scientist who says it necessarily, because they'll say, well, that scientist might be an oddball, could be an outlier. Maybe that's the one scientist in the world who believes this. But if you have a large number of scientists saying it, then it begins to be more credible. And I think that's another long-term goal we have. We want to become a large enough organization with and we have quite eminent scientists in our ranks, that people can't ignore us. And when people say, Stephen Hawking says this, but then they'll say, yes, but there's this organization of several thousand Catholic scientists, which we hope to be, we expect to be eventually, who are Catholic. So don't tell, that will, I think, dispel a lot of the false impression that the world of science is a world devoid of faith. People have gotten that impression because the people who the most vocal people up to this point have been the scientists who are atheists. And so we're trying to show that they don't speak for everybody. In a way, we weren't thinking of this, but I came across something that Pope St. John Paul II said back early in his papacy, which was that those believers, Catholics who are themselves scientists, he said, can be of great service to their fellow Catholics who are struggling to integrate science and theology in their own minds and their own lives. So those who are struggling to integrate these two things can be assisted by their fellow Catholics who are actually scientists. And so in a way, he said this, I think, in maybe the late 70s or early 80s. So in a way, we're hoping to be an answer to that call, to help others thinking through these questions. Right now, the main thing we have done is to have conferences, which is very important because the scientists getting together with these conferences, they're very excited about the experience. But we want to build up our website, have more informational resources. We want to have local chapters, student chapters at various colleges across the country, where young people can interact who are Catholics in science, can interact with the fellow students or with professors. And so there's a whole lot of things. And as I said, we want to put information on our website. One thing we're about to put on is a kind of a curated and accurate list of great and important scientists from the past who are Catholics. And we have a list of about 74 very notable, important scientists of the past who were genuinely believing Catholics. And that is a kind of one of the many kinds of information we can put on our website, which would be useful to teachers, for example, in high school. Have their students read, maybe do term papers or something on some of these. The possibilities are endless. But another thing, there are a lot of things that people have just thought of doing that you say to yourself, why didn't they do this 40 years ago? For example, I was phoned out of the blue about 8 years ago, I think it was, by someone at that time I had never heard of, who said to me on the phone that he had written a book to be used in Catholic high schools as a textbook on science and faith. And the first thing I thought when he said that is, my God, that's a brilliant idea. Why didn't somebody think of that 40 years ago? Because the time when students need to learn how to think about these issues is in high school. And there have been surveys that show that one of the main reasons that young people give for leaving the faith is that they think there's a conflict in science and religion. That may not be their actual underlying reason, but that's one of the top reasons they state. And what happens is that, and studies have shown this, is that they go to college and they're confronted by a roommate or a friend or somebody who says, don't you know that science and faith are incompatible, that if the science has shown there's no God, and they collapse like a house of cards because they have not ever thought about this before, and when confronted by this, they have no response. They're not prepared. And so that has to be done at the high school level. And fortunately, one, there's this wonderful textbook that was written. It's a second and much different edition is coming out soon, but the first edition is marvelous. It's written by a friend who's now a close friend of mine, Christopher T. Baglow. But another thing is that there are various initiatives taking place to train Catholic high school teachers how to prepare them to teach about these subjects in their own schools. And Chris Baglow, who I just mentioned, started one on his own initiative down in New Orleans, and I've been part of that. And then independently, a similar program was started at the University of Notre Dame. John Cavadini was really the person who started doing that. They've merged now, And it's all under the auspices of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. And they have these 1 week-long programs. Some of them are in New Orleans, some of them are up at Notre Dame. 1 week-long programs, and they have 30 or 40 high school teachers come in. And they read a lot of books, and they hear lectures, and they have discussions and so on to sort of prepare them to deal with this. So things are happening. At long last, people are beginning to, and the bishops are begun to recognize the importance of this issue. And they've reached out to the Society of Catholic Scientists, the American bishops, and said they would like to cooperate with us on future projects, though it hasn't happened yet, but they expressed an interest. So people are waking up, and I think I'm very full of optimism, because I think for a long time the atheists were pushing on an open door, and there was no counter effort to tell the religious side of things, and when it comes to science. But I think the future, I hope, is going to be much brighter. There's just many more things going on. I think we hopefully will be able to change the people's perception of this whole issue. Fortunately, in recent years, a number of books have come out, not all of them by Catholics. Of course, I would recommend my books. There's two. I wrote one for perhaps the more seriously dedicated person who's really interested in these questions, called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. There's another, which is a collection of articles I've written. It's called The Believing Scientist, which is not as long and maybe a bit easier to read. There's a wonderful, well, I mentioned Chris Baglow's book. Though it was written as a textbook for high schools, it could be used in college, and is a book that's is very accessible, very clear, but is for any serious-minded person, adult, who would benefit greatly from reading it. There's a book by an evangelical scientist named Francis S. Collins, and he's a very big-name scientist. Was the head of the Human Genome Project. He wrote a wonderful book called The Language of God. I recommend that book as, I think, one of the best science religion books out there. The appendix, he's not a Catholic, the appendix has some stuff on bioethical questions, which is not quite acceptable from a Catholic point of view, but nobody reads appendices anyway. The rest of the book is marvelous. Those are the ones that I would most recommend to people off the top of my head. There's some interesting books on the history of science and that show the harmony historically between science and religion. There's a book called, I think the American version was called God's Philosophers, that's very interesting about that, medieval science and how the church played a very positive role. They're a mixture of lectures, and so they usually have 2 or 3 scientists and some theologians giving talks on various science-faith questions, evolution, cosmology, and so on. Some reading is done, and that varies from. That's changed over time how much reading is required of the participants. And then there's group discussions where the teachers discuss the lectures and the readings. And there's also, they develop lesson plans for their classes. And I haven't been involved in that aspect because I don't do high school teaching. So I've been involved as someone who gives lectures or participates in group discussions. I think they have to take it very, very seriously. They need every Catholic high school, and even grade school, I would say, but especially the Catholic high school, has to have something in the curriculum for all the students, preparing them to think about these questions. Don't send them out in the world where they haven't thought at all about this, because then there'll be sheep, easy prey, and be picked off and lose their faith very quickly. It's happening. We know this is happening. So it has to be built into the curriculum. One of the problems is, at the moment, the guidelines from the bishops on how to have religion taught in the high schools, there was no space for this in the curriculum, or there's not as much space as there could be. I think it could be done as an elective, but I think every high school should have something, maybe a one-semester course. If not a course, there should be some place in the science classes and in the religion classes where it's discussed. And the good news is that this book by Christopher Baglow, the new edition of it's coming out, as I said, is a wonderful resource. And I hopefully, I mean, we're a long way from that, but that should be the goal, is that they should have something in their schools on this topic. It's absolutely vital. We live in a scientific age. Many people's view of the world is shaped much, and this is good, is shaped to a great extent by science and technology. And you can't treat religion as some sort of thing off on the side that has no relevance to this. It has to be. This is one of the things Catholic education can do, is it help people integrate, have an integrated view of the world. Our faith, and this is something we have, is that our faith gives a broader perspective on the world than people who lack faith have. And the Catholic faith is a very, very broad perspective in which people can fit all kinds of learning and put them in proper relationship to each other and in a proper perspective, instead of just having this fragmented view. Well, here's religion, or here's science, and here's history, and here's this, and here's that. To have a bigger picture, a big picture in which these different parts fit. That should be the goal of Catholic education, and so that, and science and faith have to be brought into contact in that, in some fashion. It'll vary from school to school, of course. Well, you know, the Galileo, this is the thing. So that was a black spot. That was a bad situation. The good news is it was the exception that proves the rule. It was the church has been interacting with science for 800 years, with modern science for 400 years. On the whole, that interaction has been enormously positive. I'll just quote an eminent historian of science who is a Catholic. He's an eminent historian of science at Johns Hopkins University. His name is Lawrence Principe. And in one of his books, he says, the Catholic Church has been probably the longest term and greatest patron of science in history. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. And the Galileo case was kind of like a bump, a really bad bump. It was otherwise a pretty good straight road. Okay, but that's all that people see. I think the journalists say, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, people hear the bad news and that's all they know, and they don't know all the good news that's ignored. But there was one Galileo case, but there are dozens and dozens of. In my talks, I always go through a litany of very important scientific figures who were actually Catholic priests, not just religious, but Catholic priests. The founder of the Big Bang Theory. Most people don't know that. The founder of the Big Bang Theory is a priest. The founder of genetics, most people know that, was a priest. One of the founders of astrophysics. One of the main founders of the science of geology. And you can go through a whole list. The first asteroid was discovered by an astronomer who was a priest. And there's a list as long as my arm of that. And does anybody know about that? No, they don't. Because they hear the scandalous, that one bad episode. And they don't know that Galileo was a devout Catholic till the day he died. That's the other part of the story. Galileo didn't lose his faith because of it.